So welcome to part 2, the flip-flop trail. I wanted to really focus on this example specifically because I think it does lots of work for us in how low-end globalization works and how crap stuff circulates. And I think what it does is by using the example of the flip-flop, or what we might call the thong, in that really everyday ubiquitous object, we can understand a little bit about how consumption practices around the world hang together, but also how the production side of it works. So Caroline Knowles uses the term backroads globalization. It's quite similar to low-end globalization to refer to an alternative set of routes to sort of the hegemonic globalization. So by alternative set of routes, the hubs, the big kind of dots in the route are not the same as they are for things like finance or for things like technology, commodities, etc. Low-end globalization takes a different route and what she calls the back routes. And I think that's really, really instructive for understanding how consumption operates on kind of multiple planes. And her one is this low-end back road. She said, back roads depart from the main roads with which they form significant junctions. They cross, they run alongside other main roads, forged by other streams of business animating other life. And these routes can be fragile and unstable, shifting and ad hoc and often predictable. So by following this one really simple crap object, the really cheap thong that we seem to just find that come out of nowhere. They're on the ground on a Sunday morning from people on a Saturday night. They're left at the beach. You see them in the bin. You go almost anywhere in the world and you can buy one. And they often look really, really similar and the same. There's something fascinating in that I think unravels a lot of the things we're interested in the course about consumption and everyday life. So Knowles urges scholars to adopt an approach to globalization that moves away from high-profile vectors to the way globalization is experienced by different groups of people situated in place. So we move away from those really kind of classic objects and classic ways of looking at globalization, the big corporate way, and have a look at this much messier patchwork of ways in which globalization happens.
It reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about in terms of core capitalism as well, with the relation to the idea of black markets. So like black markets happen in backroads globalization.
Yes.
They don't really go through the major ports and all that kind of stuff. Now this isn't the same kind of violence happening in here. Like core capitalism describes as much more mundane, everyday stuff. Yeah.
But like I think that's a really good point because often they'll meet and the junctions might be the same and then they'll diverge in other places as well.
Yeah.
And I think just pointing out multiple routes is really crucial. So from the website, you can see this is the route that the flip-flop takes. It starts in Kuwait as a petroleum byproduct. It moves through these shipping lanes around the bottom of South Asia all the way to South Korea where it gets processed and modified. Then as these big plastic sheets that go to 2 different locations in China and then back onto ships. And in this case, she follows a ship that goes to Ethiopia, through Djibouti and through Aden where there's a lot of piracy. And then how they then spread out across Ethiopia by the person buying them. She makes a point too that from China things go almost everywhere in lots of different places. There's lots of different routes you could follow from here, but she was particularly interested in this one.
One of the key things I think we overlook is how much plastic relies on oil. This kind of thing that comes from oil, it's relied on oil to move around the world.
And also how relatively recent this all is, that to be able to produce cheap plastic shoes that easily travel is really something that's only happened in the last 100 years or even less. Whereas prior to that, things would have been made from other kinds of processes that weren't necessarily more environmentally friendly, but the scale was so different. So what are the back roads? So it begins as oil in Kuwait, petrochemistry in Korea that separates the PE and EVA, so these different compounds from it. The plastic city in China, so that's a bigger place where the initial processing happens, the plastic village, which I'll talk about in a second. Then the logistics of getting it back out to markets, the actual physical markets in Ethiopia, and then using flip-flops to navigate through Addis Ababa in particular and its suburbs. It's how the story goes. So it just follows the life of something from its almost, birth as a byproduct of the petroleum industry to something worn on people's feet and then thrown away. It's simple in so many ways, but tells us so much. Or lost, lost. Or that bit pops out.
That's right,
this is like the most common thing to happen. So I'm just highlighting a few things from the website. So although there's an article about the flip-flop trail for the readings for this topic, and there's a whole book, she's got a whole book on it, the website has a really good set of images and these little kind of text boxes that help with the story. What I like about this is that Knowles uses the commodity, so she uses the thong or the flip-flop, and then she discusses the people's lives that are entangled and entwined with it. So we talked a lot about the entanglement of people and commodities, but we've often really talked about it just on the consumption side and not so much in the steps along the way. And what's the ones that I really like, I particularly like this factory in South Korea, which is LG Chemicals, which is a big part of a big conglomerate. LG are the same people who make televisions, etc. They're part of a chaebol, which is a big industrial conglomerate that does lots of different things in Korea. And what's really fascinating to her about the production department is she talks about the way gender operates in this corporate environment in South Korea. So not something you're expecting a flip-flop to be able to animate, but she does this really well and really skillfully. And she goes along with the workers when they socialize. That's what that picture on the side there is. And about the kind of corporate culture of doing everything together, eating together, socializing together, and the gendered parts of that. And she follows one woman in particular who works in the organization, but in a white-collar job. And so how that sort of, in a global company, like a big Korean company with a global presence, how a white-collar job in that can be gendered in a particular way. So it doesn't seem to be directly about the flip-flop, but by following the flip-flop, we begin to see how these relationships form.
Yeah.
Everyday object, global journey, what are the social relationships that it impacts, I think becomes a really interesting story.
Yeah.
And there's some karaoke in that section too. And then she's really good at discussing the actual different processes that go into what look like a really crap commodity. And so, whereas Wollaston is really keen on talking about how shoddily and poorly made crap stuff is, Knowles isn't exactly saying these are masterpieces of human ingenuity, but she's also saying they're pretty complex. To get this object that is so cheap and disposable is a pretty complex process. Weighing and mixing, rolling, assembling plastic sheets, making sure they're thick, vulcanizing, stamping of the pressing, trimming, attaching the straps, bundling, packaging, all this kind of stuff, getting the right size distributions. And she talks about trying to get the right sticker in the book. There's much more detail. The right sticker, like size 12 on the size 12, etc., etc., etc. And all these mistakes and things that can go wrong. And so she says just in this process in China, it takes around 20 people to make it. So the two sites in China are really interesting because I think often in our imagination we have this idea that China just mystically and magically produces stuff. We go, oh gosh, just made in China, or oh my gosh, we're so dependent on China to make stuff. And I think we imagine highly mechanized, high-tech production. And I think that's true in a lot of different commodities and a lot of different circumstances. And actually, in this case, the plastic city where they really work on the vulcanization process is quite high technology. But actually making flip-flops are in these small, almost, she calls it plastic village, but these small like neighborhood factories. And she discusses visiting them, and they go through neighborhoods where there's just like 20 or 30 of these little house factories doing this different kind of manufacturing. And often the family that runs it lives there, or they might run a few, and they have different workers live and stationed in different ones. Breaks down this boundary between factory and home, and it's quite a low-tech operation. All the high-tech side's done in Kuwait, South Korea, in Fuzhou in China, and then the factory home becomes where the thing gets assembled. It becomes lower and lower sort of technology as you go down. I think it brings a really human side to the kind of families that are involved in global manufacturing. So there's a lot of really interesting stories about Sun Yi and Sun Chulin and their families and how they work in this sector, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of flip-flops that they send out into the world. And then that's multiplied in all these different neighborhoods and in some other cities. But it's pretty fascinating how much it's clustered in one place.
And I think it's interesting relating this to what we talked about with gentrification, which is also a process in Western, metropolis places that increasingly blurs the line between work and leisure. This is kind of happening at the low-end side as well, where people are living in these, LG apartments, and so there's a kind of a similar process going on at either end of the kind of wealth scale of this kind of.
It's a really good point. And I think in the Korea part of this book, it's really interesting too to think about for a country that went through a sort of a devastating civil war and had to rebuild and modernize really quickly. The idea of the company providing you housing was so important. It was such an important part of their kind of corporate development. And I think that then you see a different version of it that's this kind of very outsourced version in the China bit, that the home and the factory is a way of maximizing work hours and minimizing the cost of living. Yeah. It's really, really, really fascinating. And there's this great, it has a little bit of it down there in that slide, where she talks about the family playing with children amongst all of these bits of flip-flop in different stages of production and things like that. And you realize that our separation, our attempted separation of work and life, which we feel is being increasingly invaded by digital technology, is never even on the cards for many people. Not just in things like agriculture, but also involved in these kind of ubiquitous objects.
I think it really speaks to the strength of ethnography as a research method too. You can't really take those things into consideration unless you're there seeing it.
Yeah, and stats couldn't show you this. They could maybe show you the location and how many they produce and how many people are involved.
How many people are sick and that kind of stuff. But the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life leads to that.
I think that's a really great point. There's fantastic stuff in there about the actual vulcanized plastic, which vulcanized plastic, if you read in a bit more detail and look it up, is this incredible thing. Like, we wouldn't have sneakers without vulcanized plastic. It's such a crucial way in which you get a sort of single piece of plastic that can be molded for this. And the cutter sheet. And you can then just picture these flip-flops that come off, and the photographs show them, and you often see them like that in markets around the world, just exactly as they would be assembled here. There's a really interesting bit on flexibility and living with, but also in the migrants who come to these places to work in these household factories. Again, we often think migration's a big step, like it's moving to another country or the other side of the world. And of course that happens, but for a lot of people, the disorientation of migration is moving from the country to a small house factory in an industrial city and living there with not much free time, not much social life, but just working to try and to send money back to family.
I think it was a couple of years ago, for the first time, more people lived in urban centres than rural centres. That kind of migration pattern has reached the point where most people now live in cities rather than in rural places. Yeah.
And I think it's also interesting to read infrastructure back into this. So if you read through the parts about these small factory towns, they're cities, right? They're quite industrial cities. They're sending products out through a massive port to other parts of the world. But the actual urban infrastructure is quite poor. The laneways and things are quite bad. Often the flip-flops have to get put on bicycle sort of rickshaws to bring them out the small lanes to the main roads, etc., etc., etc. So again, it's this fascinating combination of really high-tech and low-tech spaces and processes in production. We then get to Ethiopia, and she... there's a lot of drama that happens in that. If you read the book, there's piracy, there's all this security of the ship and securitization, there's all these problems at the port, there's bribes that have to be paid to get the stuff off the boat. It's really, really fascinating and interesting. But to cut through, she looks at Moapa's kiosk in Addis Ababa, and it's like a neighborhood kiosk. It's a neighborhood shop. It's really interesting in thinking about Gordon Mathews too. Like, a lot of the commodities in here are products of low-end globalization that originate elsewhere too. It's really, really interesting about what gets bought and sold there. And it even talks a little bit about it here. Unroasted coffee beans, grains, sugar, tiny bottles of oil, dried macaroni. So small quantities where people don't have a lot of money to invest in big grocery shops, etc. Often don't have refrigeration, etc., etc., etc. One cigarette at a time, etc., etc., etc. Small budgets, localized. Again, we were talking in other weeks about how digital technologies change what we consume. Here's an example of how very little has changed, except perhaps where the commodities come from themselves, but very localized purchasing and consumption in small amounts. And then follows Zima, who's a widow who buys flip-flops. She actually follows other people who buy them too, what they use them for, where they go with them, etc., etc., etc. And what I love about this is finally we see someone buying this crap object and what it means to them. And some of it is quite powerful. For Zima, it's really important to be able to walk around a lot. That's a form of mobility. To be able to go to church, to have something she can buy cheaply that's replaceable, etc. Some of the others people talked about are not as enamored with it, but then some it's really significant to have proper shoes, because the alternative for many people is bare feet. And so this is a really fascinating contrast to say the Kuwaiti petroleum people you meet at the beginning of the book, the people in these factories working white collar jobs, etc., 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 and the factory workers working blue collar jobs in relative safety and sanitization in Korea, to all the way here of people choosing between flip-flops and no shoes. It's pretty fascinating. And finally, and quite famously, it ends in this enormous dump outside Addis Ababa, and that's a really harrowing and quite awful part of the end of the journey. Of course, the dump isn't full of flip-flops, but the flip-flops end up there with a lot of other stuff. And the scratchers are the name given for the people who pick through the rubbish, and actually they often pick out things that are still usable, like flip-flops that are still usable, but also all kinds of other things, metal, glass, and other recyclables. Pretty fascinating. She actually gets to speak to some of the people who work in there, and their stories are generally pretty harrowing of how they ended up there. Now, of course, the causality here is not that flip-flops make this misery, but it's just that flip-flops or the disposal or the waste that we throw out entangles other people as well in ways that they often can't escape easily.
And this relates to the gore capitalism and necropolitics we looked at earlier, and I think in the last week I'll look at the idea of systemic violence, that, you know, this kind of example is a nice illustration of that. No, not a nice, an illustration of that.
An illustration of that, yes, that is not nice. But yeah, I really, really encourage you to read the article we have for this and to follow up more on it, because it's one of many examples. There's other works like this. I just think because the flip-flop or the thong is such a captivating item that we all know, it's kind of an easy one to follow.
Well, we associate it with Australia.
We do, yeah.
So it's interesting to see.
It is interesting to see how far it comes from.
Yeah.
And finally, just that one of the challenges that we've sort of realized as people in the last few years is that a lot of our crap isn't coming to us. We're not being able to get our crap as easily as we could before. It's true for other commodities, but obviously the more global the production, the more spread out the production of something is, the more at risk it is from interruptions to logistics. Deborah Cohen has a great book called The Deadly Life of Logistics. She discusses the global logistics system that transport commodities around the world. It's a really fascinating read alongside the flip-flop trail, because at times the flip-flop trail seems almost seamless, right, with the exception of this interruption from pirates. But in Cohen's book, it's much more about the choke points, where things get stopped, where they get held up, and the way in which governments in particular really work to try and create ways to keep things moving. Free trade zones, naval protection and defense ministries, closed ports that the public can't access.
Yep.
All of these different ways in which they can keep commodities coming in and out of places, etc.
Thinking of the ship stuck in the Suez Canal last year.
Yes.
It just holds up global
capitalism
for 2 weeks. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So one was what was on the ship, and the second was it disrupted the shipping lane.
Yep.
And all of this shows that we seem so certain about the flow of commodities and the flow of consumption, but it doesn't take much to interrupt quite dramatically. And so I think that's something really interesting to think about. One is to sort of understand these trails and their flows, and two is to recognize how vulnerable they are when they hit choke points. All right, we'll leave that part there.